Hey, Whappers, welcome in. Boy, it's been a while since we've done Around the World, so I'm happy to be back. Albeit, I've got my nice, ugly Christmas sweater to rock out here. So let's get down to business, where the topic for conversation tonight is going to be on empire building with a few of the sort of unknown Europeans that got in the mix in the New World, and that's going to be Russia and the Dutch. We'll start with Russia, and we left off with Russia talking about sort of the Russian growth within the European continent. And what I mean by that is Russia was emerging as a small but powerful state in Eastern Europe, predominantly Eastern Europe, what we know of today as the Ukraine region, especially, where Kiev was a massively important trade route or trade city within European trade routes. From there, over time, Russia began, much like the other Europeans, to spread out and to expand for many of the same reasons. Russian empire building modeled Spanish and Portuguese and British and French empire building because they were looking to expand for resources. Russia, however, was different, and here's the big difference. You know, if we're comparing empire building between Russia and Spain, for example, the difference lies in the fact that the Russians' empire building did not take place overseas. Russia built their empire on land. They spread out. They conquered to their east. And they moved into areas going almost as far east as China and Korea. The expansion of Russia's empire building in the age of exploration was massively extensive, just not overseas. They didn't take colonies in the Caribbean. They didn't go down to the Indian Ocean trade routes. They conquered as far east as they could go, and that included much of Siberia. Siberia was one of the big conquests the Russians were after, mainly for the fur trade. I put a map up at the very end of class, showing the fur trade routes, and Russia was all over those fur trade routes. That was one of their main motivations to conquer, and that was one of their main motivations to spread east. And what's also similar, other than the motivation to travel and to conquer, the Russians also waged a lot of warfare on the natives, biological warfare especially. Russian diseases wiped out millions of Arctic natives and Siberians, just like they did Native Americans when the Europeans arrived in the New World. So diseases spread throughout the Siberia region, as well as diseases spread into parts of the far reaches of the new Russian Empire. Russia's empire ultimately spread even into modern-day United States, which is kind of crazy to think about, that at one point the United States was under Russian control. And I'm talking, of course, about Alaska. Parts of Alaska fit right into this new Russian empire building because Alaska had a bunch of valuable furs, and seals provided hides as well that were used, and whaling as well for blubber, and whale skins were just as important as the fur trade. So Russians spread out and built themselves a massive empire. Although, again, remember, the difference being the Russians' empire building was on land. It was not done overseas. Conversely, let's talk about another overseas, though. I want to jump back into the Netherlands, which, here's something to keep in mind. The Netherlands is another name for Holland. Holland and the Netherlands are political states, countries, and they go by the same term. So you can get away with saying both, Holland or Netherlands. Now, ethnically, these are the Dutch, and so I like to just call them the Dutch because it's a little bit easier to remember, and it makes you think of the great coffee, the Dutch Brothers Coffee here in Phoenix. But if I ever refer to Holland or the Netherlands, realize we're talking about the Dutch people. Now, see, whereas the Russians built their empire over land, the Netherlands, the Dutch, followed a blueprint very similar to the Portuguese and the Spanish and the British and the French. The Dutch went overseas, and the Dutch gained access to two areas, just like the Spanish and Portuguese. The Dutch ventured off into the New World. They went to the Americas. They conquered islands down in the Caribbean. And they even had territories in modern-day New York. That was first discovered by a Dutch sailor named Henry Hudson, who was actually British, but he worked for the Dutch. But the Dutch also conquered territories in Asia, Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia. Indonesia would be colonized heavily by the Dutch, and that would be their crown jewel in Asia. So the Dutch had bases of operation in both Asia and in the Americas. And you can use the same pattern with the Dutch that we've done so far with the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish. Diseases, labor, slave labor, indentured servitude. The Dutch brought all those characteristics into the New World, just like they did in Asia. But the introductory point that I want to bring up with the Dutch, that's brand new, something that the Dutch pioneered that other Europeans would model themselves on as well. And that is going to be, and I'm going to have to actually change this, so don't get too sick here. I'm changing because my battery is about to die. So I need to charge the battery so we can finish our ATW here. So I flipped the script here. I'm all the way around. Thanks for your patience. The topic that I want to introduce here with the Dutch is I have some visitors here. I'm just finishing up a fireside chat. You guys can come in. I'm finishing up for the world history. So the key point about the Dutch that I want to go into is the fact that the Dutch were some of the first Europeans that formed what are called joint stock companies. And you may have remembered this term from 7th grade if you took U.S. history last year. The joint stock companies are truly unique in world history because they're some of the first companies that utilize what we see today as a very common practice in companies, businesses, which is a stock. And the idea behind stock is that investors, people that are not owning the company, buy actually into shares of the company. So let's say that I'm going to invent a company that helps students guarantee to get 5s in the AP World History exam. We'll call it, Mr. Smith's AP World History Beast Mode. I don't care, whatever, stupid name, but fine. And I have a company. I'm going to build a company. Now, I want to raise money for that company. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask former AP World History students to invest some money in the company. Now, why are they going to invest in the company if they're not going to get anything in return? That's the idea of giving them stock. I give the investors a piece of the company, a little percentage of the company. And the understanding is that when I give them that percentage of the company, they're then going to get money in return. So as the company grows and does better business and more students are getting 5s in the AP, now those investors are going to reap the benefits of the profits that come along with the higher scores. Most businesses in the world today function this way. Major companies such as Apple and Facebook and Yahoo and Google and Yelp and Nike, you name it. Most big companies have stock, and you can buy into the shares of the stock. And then essentially you own a little sliver of the company depending on how much stock you buy. The Dutch pioneered this many, many, many years ago in the age of exploration. What they realized was if we create joint stock companies, we can get investors to pay to raise money for exploration. And so rather than it being the government that is financing these long distance travel, rather it's private businesses that were actually the ones that hired the crews, that built the ships, that paid for the journeys, that provided supplies. So the Dutch were the first to pioneer this, and their main business that they did this with, their big joint stock company, was one of the wealthiest businesses of its era. In fact, of all time, believe it or not. I have some really cool slides to show you tomorrow on this. I think you guys will be really impressed. And that company is known as the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was a private joint stock company created by private investors in the Netherlands. And not just Dutch investors. All sorts of people could invest in these companies, just like all sorts of people from all over the world can invest in Nike or Google or Facebook or whatever. And this joint stock company had financed ships and journeys that would go all over the world. And wherever those ships and journeys and those ships journeyed to, and wherever they went, when they planted their flag in the soil, being a Dutch company, the Dutch government got to claim that land, but it's the joint stock company that got to reap the benefits of the profits. In a way, this is sort of like private mercantilism. The joint stock companies are the mother country in this example, and it's the joint stock companies that are going to make all the profits. So all the riches and all the goods that are produced in those colonies, for example, in Indonesia, one of the great resources that came out of there were spices. Indonesia was rich with spices. So the Dutch East India Company got a lot of spices from their journeys and from their journeys to Indonesia. The profits of that did not go to the Dutch government. It went to the Dutch East India Company. And so therefore, we have a sense of private mercantilism, something that was brand new and really shaping and having a significant impact on the way that trade and commerce worked in the age of exploration. Other countries would soon follow suit. Ultimately, there'd be the British East India Company, and there'd be all sorts of joint stock companies that grew up out of this age of mercantilism, this age of discovery. So that's pretty much going to be it for today. I'm going to focus tomorrow in conversation a little bit on the joint stock companies. So whatever questions you have on joint stock companies or Russian empire building, feel free to bring those into class. But for the rest of the evening, I wish you guys the best. Have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow. Remember, the past shapes the future. Take care.